Hey, what's up guys, it's Matt with the Movement System. In this video, we're gonna cover how to finally loosen your hips in a way that actually works. A lot of people struggle with hip mobility. A lot of people try different stretches and different exercises they see online and don't really get a lot of relief. In this video, we're gonna cover two strategies that I've found to work particularly well with a lot of the clients that I've worked with. But before we get into those two strategies, we essentially need to know what's going on at the hip so we know what we're trying to improve. When it comes to rotating through the hips, there's two main motions. There's hip external rotation, which looks like this if you're laying down on the ground and the leg is coming across the midline of the body. Typically, we're looking for 50 to 60 degrees of hip external rotation, range of motion. And then the second motion of hip rotation is hip internal rotation. And internal rotation is actually when the leg is going out to the side. And typically for this motion, we're looking for 30 degrees or more of range of motion. Out of these two motions, I find that for a lot of people, hip internal rotation is the one that's a lot more limited, feels stiff and tight. And this is really important to address because hip internal rotation is what helps us feel comfortable in the bottom portion of a squat, and it's also the motion that helps us extend our hip fully when we're sprinting and jumping. So if we're lacking hip internal rotation range of motion, oftentimes we're gonna feel uncomfortable deep in a squat or deep in a lunge. We might also feel unstable on one leg in exercises like split squats. And we also might lack power in jumping and sprinting motions. If we can clear up that hip internal rotation with the two strategies that we're going to cover today, those motions often improve over time. And I think it's important to mention 30 degrees is kind of the textbook answer for what is a good hip internal rotation range of motion. I've worked with clients that have had as little as negative 10 degrees of hip internal rotation, and they couldn't even walk straight without their knee out to the side. Oftentimes this is when you see that gait pattern where people have their knees kind of bowed out to the side, and gaining any amount of hip internal rotation, even getting to zero, will significantly improve mobility. I've also worked with dancers who had 30 degrees on one side and 50 degrees on the other side. In that case, they even needed to go beyond 30 degrees for the demands of their sport. So either lay down or stand up and do this very basic hip internal rotation range of motion test. March your knee up to a 90-degree angle and pull your leg out to the side. You want to do this without lifting your hips up because that will give you a false impression of a lot of range of motion. Chances are, if you're like a lot of athletes that I work with, you have some tightness there. Maybe you're getting to 15 or 20 degrees of range of motion. We're going to go through two strategies that you can try so that way you can retest this range of motion. And if you do these exercises right, you should see an immediate improvement of 5, maybe even 10 degrees of range of motion just from these two exercises. So let's briefly cover the anatomy of what's going on with these two movements, and then we're going to get into the demonstrations. All right, there could be a couple different things going on at the hips that could be limiting your internal rotation. One of the most common problems associated with hip internal rotation is not enough room in the front side of the joint. Meaning that whenever you try to internally rotate your hip or rotate that leg forward to do that motion where the leg's coming out to the side, what's going to happen is the front of the joint is just not going to have space to rotate into. This can come because the posterior side or the back side of the hip is very tight and it's pushing everything forward. If this is the case, then what we need to do is create some length in the back so that way we can actually shift the femur back in the socket and create room that we can internally rotate into. This is the premise behind the two strategies that we're going to show you, where we're going to activate the adductor in the front side to help facilitate or increase relaxation of the back side or the posterior hip capsule. All right, let's go ahead and show you strategy number one. All right, strategy number one involves an adductor roll. This means that we're gonna move the hips like this, but we're gonna try to focus on one leg at a time. So one leg, in this case the left, is gonna stay stationary, and I'm gonna squeeze into the foam roller and I'm gonna pull back and forward. Importantly, I'm gonna keep pressure on the inside of the foot as I'm doing this exercise. This is going to allow me to activate the adductor and get some relaxation in the back side of the hip. This sitting position is just one way to do this exercise. You can use a ball between the knees or a foam roller, squeeze together, and then pull back and go forward. I've tried this in a couple different positions with different clients, and the two that I like the most are number one, the seated position, where we're just learning the motion, and then number two, side lying, so we get the weight of the leg and gravity to kind of help with adduction. One other option that you can try with this exercise is putting your feet on the wall and then putting pressure on your big toe and the inside of your heel, and then trying to do the same movement, pushing that knee up and then pulling back down while squeezing the foam roller at about 50% as hard as you can the whole time. Make sure that as you're doing this exercise, you're breathing fully and deeply. What I recommend is doing this for about 60 seconds, 1 or 2 times, and then retesting your range of motion. See if your range of motion improved or stayed the same. If it improved, you're on the right track. If it stayed the same, maybe try a couple different positions and try those full exhales. Make sure the pressure's in the right area to make the exercise most effective. A slightly more advanced version of this that you can progress to is a Copenhagen plank with a pelvic tilt. Now this is a fairly challenging exercise, but it's really great for getting into the adductor in different positions of your hip. What we're gonna do with this exercise is put your knee on the box with the top leg bent at 90 degrees, and the bottom leg is also gonna be bent at 90 degrees with the foot on the side of the box. This is going to allow us to tilt our hips forward and back slightly. The adductor muscle has a line of pull forward and backward, not just towards the middle. So by tilting the hips slightly forward and back, we're getting to a lot more adductor fibers than we can get with just one plane of motion. Similar to the adductor roll, we want to make sure that we're squeezing that inner thigh, and we want to make sure that we have a straight line between the head, the hips, and the knees. We don't want to have the hips sagging down too much, or it's going to take away from the movement. Now you might be wondering, why are we choosing to activate our adductor instead of just directly stretching hip internal rotation or trying to strengthen that range of motion with something like an IR liftoff or a hip internal rotation stretch? And the reason for that is that you have to create room first before you start pushing into that range of motion and strengthening. If you already have a really tight posterior hip capsule, not a lot of room in the front of the hip, then oftentimes you're just going to further irritate the hip by pushing into that range of motion before you create space. So specifically, whenever it's something called closing angle joint pain, or whenever going into the position of hip internal rotation or going into a deep squat causes a pinch or pain in the front of the hip, that's whenever I really advise away from starting with stretching, and we create the space first by activating the adductor and creating length in the posterior hip capsule, and then later, once you have that space, you can do more stretches with that new range of motion. All right, and now let's go ahead and get into strategy number 2 for improving hip internal rotation range of motion. And that is going to be an offset exercise. That could be an offset hip hinge or an offset split squat exercise. Quite often, people who lack hip internal rotation do a lot of exercises that are very sagittal plane, meaning they do bilateral squats, they do a lot of things with their knees out and supinating the foot, but they never really get into the inside of their foot and create length by crossing midline. So we're gonna do that with 2 different exercises. Number 1 would just be an offset hip hinge, where we're focusing on putting weight through the inside of the foot, and then we're hinging and we're reaching the ball towards the outside of the foot. When we're doing this, we want to be really specifically pushing the hip backwards. You can do this with a weight, you can do this unweighted, you can do this with a med ball. The implement doesn't really matter. What really matters is that the motion is correct, that we're pushing the hip backwards, that we have weight through the inside of the foot, and that we're creating length in the posterior hip capsule. If we're doing this exercise right and we get a really good hip hinge position, we're going to feel a stretch that we could put one finger on right in the back of the hip. That's a really good indication that you know that you're getting length at the right area and that you're going to see improvements in your hip internal rotation range of motion. And then another good way to do that is with a split squat with a rotation. Same idea, we're gonna be rotating across the body. We're gonna be focusing on keeping the knee and the inside of the foot with pressure, and that's gonna create length in that back of the hip. As we rotate down, we load up that hip. And if we do this exercise a few times, we really get into the back of the hip, and then we drop the ball, and then we go into our bilateral squats, we're gonna feel a lot more comfortable and have a lot more room in the front of the hip as we get into that deep squat position. So bottom line is this: if you're struggling with your hip mobility, you first need to create space, and then you need to train within that space. Using the adductor roll, the Copenhagen plank, the split squat with a rotation, or the offset hip hinge are all good strategies to create that space, so that way you can go back to all the other exercises in your program that weren't as comfortable before and have your hips feel a lot better doing them. Now, although we fit as much as we could into this video, you guys have had a lot of questions about hip mobility, so I decided to create a full 1-hour webinar going over my entire hip mobility system. If you're catching this video right when it comes out, you can register register for the upcoming hip mobility webinar on May 23rd. You'll be able to be there live and comment with questions as we go through some different exercises and strategies. In the past, we've charged $50 to $100 for webinars like this, but we're making this one completely free. Also, we're going to have a recording go out after the fact, so if you missed the webinar for any reason, but you're registered, then you'll get a link to watch the recording. So I'll put a link in the description below to register so you can attend live or watch the recording. If you guys do have any other questions, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.